Hi everyone. In this video I want to go over a couple of the assignments that you've completed recently that focus on evaluating sources. The first of these relates to the group discussion that you had where you used the CRAP worksheet to analyze web resources. These are the kind of sources you might encounter just in everyday searches for information, but you also might encounter them when you're looking for particular resources for studying a research topic. Most of you were able to identify these in correct order, but I want to highlight a few other things. So if we just go through the websites, as they're listed, I just want to draw your attention to a couple of things with each of these websites. Not everything that was covered, but a few things. So the first one is this Neurologica blog. So an important thing to recognize about blogs is that anyone can write one, and there is no editor of a blog. At least not normally. On occasion, a blog will be tied to a particular publication, and there might be an editor in those situations. But for the most part, a blog is just whatever somebody wants to write, and there's no one else checking it or looking at the factual information before it gets published. That doesn't mean they're all bad, but it does mean you should bring a sort of an additional level of scrutiny to the material that's provided. So a couple of the things with this blog to know are it's really important to pay attention to who the author is, because anyone can write it. So if it's just somebody off the street, it's probably not high quality information. In this case, the author is an academic clinical neurologist, so I'm sure a pretty bright, smart guy, but his expertise doesn't necessarily fit with the topic that he's writing about. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind. So just because we're experts in one area doesn't mean we're experts in another. And this is a situation where he's writing on something that probably a researcher in the world of communication or media or even psychology has a little bit more understanding of the topic in general than a medical doctor. The other thing to keep in mind with this blog is that while there are a few links in the article to resources he uses to develop his argument, he doesn't provide us with any further references that would allow us to understand where he's getting his information from. So one of the key things to think about when you're analyzing sources is, do they provide you with the information you need in order to be able to really understand where they're getting their resources and to ask deep questions. This one doesn't do a great job with that. If we move on to the resource, the American Scientist resource, one of the first things to think about is the American Scientist is a publication. It's not just a blog, and that means it has an editor and it probably has a team of fact checkers. So already there is a group of people that have been engaged in the process of making sure this is quality information before it ever gets to you as the reader. You can also look up the authors here. One of the things you'll find is that unlike the blog, these authors do have expertise in the area that they're writing in. If you scroll down and you start to just skim through the article, one of the things you know is that there's a lot of references being made to actual studies that were done, and that these provide evidence for the claims that are being made. So even if the links to these studies aren't provided, they give me what I need to know to be able to go look up the studies and see what that information is and how these individuals are using that information. There's also references to sort of key experts in these areas. So Habermas in particular, a kind of key expert in the field of communication studies. So they're drawing on sort of a deep scholarly roots to make their arguments. And finally, unlike the blog, they do also provide us with some specific resources in a bibliography that we can go to, that we can find in order to assess overall the quality of material that they're using in the construction of their argument. So one of the key things to look for when you're assessing these sources is just the level of detail that the author provides to you. That level of detail doesn't mean that you necessarily agree with the source or not, but that it gives you more information to be able to ask questions about how the authors are arriving at their conclusions or making their claims. That's more important than whether you agree with it or not. So if we move on to the Pew article, one of the things that we learn if we look through this is that not only are they drawing on the research of others to construct their arguments, but they're also doing their own research. So they are being researchers in this case. More important than that, they're telling us how they did the research. So if you go here, they give a link to the Research Center study, and they tell us a little bit about who was included in the study. They tell us a bit more if we scroll down. If we read through the whole thing, we'd start to learn the information about, well, how did they collect this evidence? How many people were asked, right? What kinds of things were they asked? Right? How did they arrive at the conclusions that they came to? The most important thing is that they give us a lot of information about how they constructed their results, how they came to their results and their conclusions. We might not agree. We might challenge some of the ways that they went about collecting their information, but this is a high quality source because we have what we need to be able to ask those questions. That's even more true when we get to a scholarly source. So in addition to providing us this information, scholarly sources go through peer review. This is sort of the gold standard for assessing, the gold standard for sort of an editing process. Because in addition to an editor, like a magazine might have, a scholarly journal means that this article was sent to at least 3 other experts who study the same thing as these researchers, who have published also research in this area, who have vetted very closely this article, suggested changes or alterations, and that this article went through that whole process before it's ever published and provided for you to read. So you can feel pretty confident in the level of information that's there. More importantly, however, though, if we scroll down here, they're going to give us a very, very detailed example, discussion of exactly how they went about arriving at the information that they provide to back up the claims that they are making. So, of course, they're doing their own study. They're relying a lot on other studies, which you can read about in the literature review. And they're telling you in a really detailed way how they did their study. So again, you might not agree with it. You might actually read this and say, well, you left out this, or you didn't think about that, or, you know, I wonder if this is a fair conclusion to come to from these numbers. That's less important than the fact that you can ask all those questions because of the material that they've provided. That makes it a high quality source. That's very different than the natural news source. Oh, that's not this one. One of the first things that you should do always if you come across a source that is in a publication that you have not encountered before is to look up the publication. And if you did that in this case, the first thing you would find is that this is a questionable publication. A lot of people have already written about how natural news is well known for publishing false information. It tends to be fairly biased. You can tell this just by looking at the other kinds of headlines that they advertise. You know, they're pretty much clickbait. Or the advertisements that exist on the page itself. I mean, it has advertisements, which a lot of the other sources do not. And the advertisements are for questionable medical supplements. So that alone should give you some pause. Beyond that, when you look through the source itself, you'll find that the links that they provide, if you follow those links and read through what the material is, don't necessarily fit with how they're using them. And aside from the BBC, the rest of the resources that they provide are questionable resources. So these are all things that you really want to think about when you're evaluating web resources. If we keep those in mind when we come back, we would end up ranking the natural news as the worst source that's there, the blog source as the second worst, the American Scientist as the third best or worst, the Pew Internet article as second best, and the scholarly source as the best. And really the key thing here is which sources provide you with the most information to be able to ask questions about the material they collected, the claims that they're making, the research that they've conducted. The other assignment I want us to pay attention to is the evaluating relevance assignment. So as I mentioned in the last one, scholarly sources are ones that you can have a pretty high level of confidence in just because of the peer review process. That doesn't mean you agree with them. It doesn't mean that there aren't better or worse sources, but it means that they've went through a vetting process where you should feel fairly confident in the factual information that they're providing, as well as they give you a lot of information so you can ask your own questions. But one of the difficult things when you are the researcher and trying to find quality sources to use for your own research process with scholarly sources is this relevant to the topic I am writing about? A few things to keep in mind is this can be difficult. It can be difficult to find out whether something is relevant because it might be kind of related, but not totally related to what you're doing. It may be about fake news, but only kind of partially about what you're interested in. This means there's really no right or wrong answer, but there are better or worse sources to use. It depends a lot in how you're paying attention to the source and what kind of information you're pulling out of that source in terms of relating it to your topic. This is super important for literature reviews and writing literature reviews, because what you're wanting to do in that process, which we'll talk about a little bit further in the class, is you're trying to show how a source relates to another source and to your topic overall. So one of the most important questions to ask when you're thinking about a scholarly source is this: how does this help me think about my topic? It may help you think about your topic in a number of different ways, but when you're writing your literature review, you're going to want to show your reader how it is doing this. And that's going to be sort of a key thing to consider. So a few things about this assignment overall. I wanted you to look at all of the abstracts and tell me if you'd use them or why you wouldn't. Not everybody did that, and that was a little bit on me because when I reread the directions, they seem a little less than clear. So you weren't graded down substantially for that. The other thing is you were asked to take on this sort of hypothetical. This is your research topic when you're thinking through these. Some people related it to their own research topic, and so it didn't work out quite as well. But again, the important thing to think about is, like, how do you pull out certain kinds of information to show whether it would be relevant? So I'm just going to point to a few examples. For instance, in this first one, talking to broadcasters on Twitter, networked gatekeeping in Twitter conversations with journalists. You may end up choosing not to use this because you might decide it's not really about how people are getting their information. It's more about what's happening with the broadcasters, or the journalists themselves, how they're working to sort of gatekeep certain articles. And so that might not be what your topic's about, so you might not choose to use it. But you also could highlight other aspects, like how citizens engaged, or how politically active citizens interacted. If I focus on that information, it might be more relevant.